Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Great to be here.
Today, we're jumping into some really fascinating source material, and let's be honest, it's pretty challenging stuff, too.
Absolutely. We're looking at excerpts from the Talmud of Jmmanuel.
Right, which is linked to Billy Edward Albert Meier.
And this is not your typical religious text, is it?
Yeah.
It presents a version of history, spiritual teaching even, that really clashes with conventional beliefs.
It really does. The sources we've got cover specific teachings, quite a few prophecies, and, wow, some extensive commentary.
Yeah, really critical commentary, especially targeting established religions like Christianity and putting forward these, well, alternative views.
So the mission for this deep dive, what we want to do is unpack the key nuggets of knowledge, the main insights from this unique material.
We want to help you navigate its claims, understand the perspectives it offers, no matter how unconventional they might seem.
Okay, let's unpack this then.
Sounds good.
So right at the heart of this material is this figure presented as Jmmanuel.
And straight away, the sources hit you with a pretty provocative claim.
Which is?
That the name Jesus Christ is basically an alias, an invention.
An invention? By who?
Well, they say it was concocted by religious forces. They specifically point fingers at Jmmanuel's own brother, Jacob, and someone called Paul.
And Jmmanuel himself?
Had nothing to do with it, according to this source. Nothing to do with what they call these concocted teachings.
Okay, so this text, the Talmud of Jmmanuel, TJ, is it sometimes called?
Yeah, TJ. It's presented as this document discovered way back in 1963.
And supposedly translated from Aramaic into German?
That's the claim. But then, here's the twist, it was allegedly destroyed.
Destroyed when?
In 1974. And the reason given is because its contents were seen as, well, heresies for Christianity and Judaism.
Which probably explains why mainstream scholars aren't exactly queuing up to study it.
Exactly. The sources themselves say scholars tend to ignore it because of these so-called heresies, plus the fact the originals are gone.
And its connection to the whole Billy Meier UFO contactee case, right?
Right. That association definitely adds another layer of controversy.
So what about Jmmanuel himself? What did the sources say he taught or claimed?
Well, several key things. He's called the King of Wisdom.
Yeah.
And also, interestingly, the son of Gabriel, the celestial son.
Celestial son. Okay. Any specific teachings jump out?
Yeah, there is a strong emphasis on caring for your spirit and knowledge first.
Yeah.
Like before you worry about food, drink, clothes.
Why is that?
The idea is that worry about physical stuff can actually crowd out wisdom and knowledge. You need to prioritize the spirit.
Interesting. What about things like miracles? The healing of the paralytic, for instance?
It's mentioned, but with a specific interpretation. The healing isn't just Jmmanuel's power acting alone.
No.
It's attributed to the paralytic's own faith in Jmmanuel's spirit's power and also their confidence in his teachings.
And those teachings are described as?
As the teachings of nature and of creation. So grounded in the natural order.
He's also quoted making predictions, isn't he, about the temple in Jerusalem?
Yes, predicting its destruction. He apparently said the Israelite people trespass against life and the truth, built their city on blood.
And he made a distinction, didn't he, between different groups?
He did. According to the source, he differentiated between Israelites, who he called sons of Zion, wanting to kill him, and Jews, who he saw as sort of misled believers he was trying to bring truth to.
There are also proverbs mentioned, right, attributed to him.
Yeah, proverbs of wisdom. And they're said to come directly from the laws of creation, things you can see in nature.
So wisdom isn't just given, you have to work for it.
Exactly. It requires thinking, seeking. The wise, according to these proverbs, don't grieve over loss or mourn the dead. And a key point, harm no faultless creatures.
There's also a big philosophical point about unity, isn't there?
Huge point. The source really emphasizes this. It claims everything is one. Spirit, body, all part of creation, which is fundamentally spirit.
So no duality, no trinity.
Explicitly not. The source states, the teachings state that there is a unity and not in any way or form a duality or trinity. That's a direct challenge to Christian doctrine, obviously.
And he faced consequences for these kinds of teachings.
Oh, yeah. The source mentions him being brought before the high council, accused of saying things like, God is not creation, but simply a man.
And also about his origin.
Right, being begotten by a guardian angel, Gabriel. These were serious accusations.
Okay, this leads us to the account of his death. And this is where the source material gets really, really radical compared to the traditional story.
Absolutely. It claims that after the spear thrust on the cross, he wasn't actually dead.
Not dead. So what happened?
Joseph of Arimathea found him alive. The source goes into detail. Joseph, helped by some Hindu friends who had specific medicines, herbs, used a secret entrance to the tomb, apparently only Joseph knew about it, and helped Jmmanuel recover. And quickly, too, like in 3 days.
3 days.
Then, crucially, Jmmanuel supposedly warned his disciples not to reveal he had survived. Keep it secret.
Wow. That completely reframes the resurrection narrative.
Completely. And there's another detail. A guardian angel later appears to Mary, tells her not to seek a living person among the dead, and then just vanishes in a bright light.
So a very different sequence of events.
Fundamentally different.
Okay, so that's the picture painted of Jmmanuel in the supposedly hidden text. Let's move from that history to the prophecies. These seem pretty central, too.
They are. And they're extensive. They cover Jmmanuel's time, our time, and even the distant future. Some really stark stuff in there.
Like what? What's one of the first ones?
Well, one concerns the fate of his own teachings. He supposedly told his disciples to write them down.
Right.
But that they'd only be revealed 2 times 1,000 years later. So 2,000 years in the future.
Revealed by whom?
By an unassuming man.
And until then, what happens to the teachings?
He predicted they'd be falsified. They'd turn into an evil cult, causing much human blood to flow. Because he apparently believed people just weren't ready to comprehend them yet. Still too immature, spiritually speaking.
And he even blamed his own disciples for part of this.
Yeah, that's striking. He supposedly reprimanded them directly, saying, "Yourselves will do much toward falsifying my teachings in the future."
Harsh.
Very. Warning they'd cause misguidance and false teachings with great reverberations. Basically, their misinterpretations would have huge negative consequences.
Okay. Then there's this prophecy about a new time prophet, or a new herald.
Yes, a figure predicted to appear before the end of 2 times 1,000 years. So, before the 2,000 years are up.
And this person's role?
To recognize Jmmanuel's unfalsified teachings as the truth, and then spread them with great courage, but initially only to small groups.
Is it supposed to be easy for this prophet?
Anything but. The prophecy says he'll be heavily persecuted, not just by wrong-minded people, but by the whole world and many deluded religious cults.
That's like a tough gig.
Extremely. Very difficult and full of obstacles. It even specifies where he'll start. A peace-loving country in the north, which, however, will be dominated by a strict and false religious cult based upon scriptural distortions.
Any more details about this figure?
Quite a few. He's called the founder of the group of truth, someone who'll break secrets about creation, the human mind, be incredibly knowledgeable. His numbers associated with 1, 3, and 7. He'll travel a lot, speak harsh truths, be relentlessly dedicated to his work, infuse his words with energy, and importantly, record everything.
Okay. Now, alongside this new herald, the sources paint a really grim picture of the future, don't they? Global crises, human degeneration.
Incredibly grim. And a central point, maybe the central point here, is that the source pins everything on one cause.
Which is?
Overpopulation. It explicitly identifies overpopulation as the singular root cause of all problems.
Wow, the singular cause.
That's the claim. Breaking nature's laws, destroying nature itself, plundering resources, leading to massive destruction worldwide. It's presented as the fundamental issue.
And this leads to other predicted disasters.
Yes, specifically worsening natural disasters. Things like landslides and avalanches, earthquakes and seaquakes, every kind of storms, even primeval volcanic eruptions.
The earth fighting back, almost.
That's the language used. The earth raising itself against the people, quaking, tearing hundreds of thousands to death, destroying whole countries.
And it's not just nature, it's human behavior, too.
Oh, absolutely. Widespread moral degeneration is forecast. People becoming like beasts.
How so?
Focused only on acquisition, power, lust, addiction, and greed. Crime, murder, mass murder, abuse escalating, especially among youth because of failed upbringing.
Anything else?
A rise in cowardice, people unable to handle pain or suffering. Inhumane terror attacks, torture, war sliding into barbarism.
Barbarism.
Yeah, people demanding their neighbor's death just for having different views. Hate and revenge spreading like wildfire. Organizations trying to bring order will be hindered. Atrocities becoming commonplace. Lack of mutual help. It's bleak.
It sounds like societal collapse.
Pretty much. The prophecies mention evil wars multiplying, countries falling apart, names changing because of conquest.
And unrest from within societies.
Yes, various groups, workers, beggars, extremists, anarchists, neo-Nazis provoking misery, terror, revolution against authorities, even storming the palaces of the rich and powerful.
The source also gets specific about moral decay in terms of relationships and sexuality.
It does. It predicts fornication becoming rampant, including incest, same-sex acts, child abuse happening openly with weak penalties.
And the consequences.
It claims this makes family bloodlines unclean, spreading illnesses and epidemics, a lack of true love, replaced only by carnal or sexual desire.
So the overall picture is one of fear and chaos.
Exactly. Fear, destruction, degeneration everywhere. Fear making people close their eyes and ears. Suspicion rampant. No rest. Just being driven constantly towards chaos and the abyss.
And the source's overall assessment of humanity during this period.
It's scathing. Humans will remain faint-hearted and a dwarf in the development of his knowledge and wisdom and love. Driven by power, domination.
Heads full of.
Unnecessary and false knowledge. Mad, religious, sectarian, philosophical, militaristic teachings. Futilely searching for truth in all the wrong places, like religions and sects.
Wow. That is incredibly dark. Is there any positive outlook offered?
There is, eventually.
Yeah.
A positive turning point is prophesied, but it's a long way off.
How long?
800 years after the New Time prophet's death. So we're talking centuries after the difficult period.
And what happens then?
Humans will finally open their eyes and ears. They'll break free from these God cults and turn towards the truth of the Spirit and the creation.
Needing to.
Understanding each other, forming a large community, true love, creating peace and freedom, humanity uniting, and eventually everyone speaking one special language.
The birth of a new humanity.
That's what it calls it. The birth of the new, the real and true human.
Okay. So a very long arc from crisis to transformation. Let's shift now to the critique of religion and history. This feels like a huge chunk of the source material.
It really is. And the core nugget, I think, is the claim that much of what we accept as religious history, especially in Christianity, isn't just mistaken. It's based on deliberate fraud, pious fraud, forgery.
For what purpose?
Power, mostly. Control. Manipulation.
The sources start with the idea that belief itself is kind of arbitrary, right? Dependent on where you're born.
Yeah, that belief is largely a matter of environment. The quote suggests, if you're born Muslim, you turn to Mecca. Born Christian, you turn to Christ. The cradle determines the creed.
And they contrast faith with intelligence.
Strongly. They argue faith is not intelligent or of reason, doesn't require intelligence. But things like disbelief, doubt, questioning, rejecting superstition that's an act of intelligence often takes courage, too.
And that, quote, toleration only came in when faith went out.
Pretty pointed, isn't it? Sets the stage for the claims of fraud.
So let's get into those specific claims. The Septuagint translation, for example.
Right, the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. The source calls it a pious fraud, claiming it was based on a forged letter.
And they give a specific example.
Yes, Isaiah 7.14. They claim the original Hebrew simply says a young woman has conceived, but it was supposedly mistranslated in the Septuagint as virgin shall be with child.
And the significance of that alleged mistranslation.
Huge significance because, according to the source, Matthew's gospel then used that specific Greek translation to create the scriptural basis for the virgin birth of Jesus. So a core doctrine based on a mistranslation, they argue.
That's a massive claim. What about the word Elohim in Genesis?
Another major linguistic argument. The source points out Elohim is plural. It means gods. But it's translated over 2,500 times as the singular God.
So the claim is the original texts were polytheistic.
Essentially, yes. That they reveal primitive polytheistic idolatry. They point to phrases like, let us make man an image RUR, or become like one of us, or let us go down, as clear evidence of this original plurality that was later deliberately obscured to fit monotheism.
So the sources are saying it goes beyond just translation errors to actual distortion of the original meaning and even the texts themselves.
Exactly. They flat out claim the New Testament books are Catholic documents.
Meaning?
Originated by the early Catholic Church, which they call the one true church, and they accuse this church of having itself forged all the books of the New Testament and all the documents of religious dogma.
Forged them? That's extreme.
It is. Perpetrating pious frauds and being the chief beneficiary. They even accuse other Christian sects of knowing about these supposed frauds, but passing on the stolen counterfeit anyway.
That's a sweeping condemnation. Do they name names? What about the early church fathers? People like Augustine, Tertullian?
Oh, they get heavily criticized.
Uh.
Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Tertullian, Lactantius, Augustine, the source called them ex-pagan fathers.
Ex-pagan?
Yeah, implying they brought their pagan mindset with them, accusing them of lacking intellectual honesty, veracity, credibility, mingling fable and fact, lying for God's glory, being monumentally superstitious and credulous.
And they call early Christianity itself.
That new paganism, later called Christianity, suggesting it wasn't a clean break, but more of a rebranding or absorption of pagan ideas.
Do they give examples of this alleged borrowing from paganism?
Several. They mention Mithraism, an ancient mystery religion, claiming it had things like a hierarchy and devils like Asmodeus before Judaism or Christianity, and that Christians just absorbed the system.
Well,
Claiming Christian fathers accepted pagan miracles as real, appealed to pagan oracles and sibyls, even used forged or altered sibylline oracles to prove Christian events.
so recycling pagan stories.
That's the accusation, using popular allusions from Hellenistic culture, like curing blindness by spitting. Recounting pagan myths as Christian miracles, they cite a story from Lucian about a man restored to life as an example later used by Christians.
Even well-known miracles are questioned.
Yes, like the liquefaction of St. Januarius' blood. The source casts doubt on it, noting that claims of scientific verification are not always verifiable.
Are specific texts identified as forgeries?
Yes. The Book of Enoch, for instance, called a composite, sometimes quoted as genuine early on, but later condemned.
What about within the New Testament itself?
The ending of Mark's Gospel, chapter 16, verses 9 to 20 is mentioned. The source says it's admittedly not original, just compiled later from bits of John and Acts.
Anything else?
Variations in the Lord's Prayer between Matthew and Luke are called confessed forgeries. Paul's interpretation of the unknown God inscription in Athens from the book of Acts, called a fraudulent perversion.
How so?
The source claims Paul conveniently left out the full inscription, which supposedly read, "To the gods of Asia, Europe, and Africa, to all foreign and unknown gods," plural gods again.
And the Trinity, that foundational doctrine.
A major target. Specifically the passage in John chapter 5, verse 7, the three heavenly witnesses. The source calls it an outright forgery, interpolated meaning added later specifically to provide scriptural support for the Trinity.
How do they support that claim?
They point out it's missing from the oldest Greek manuscripts. They even claim the Church forbade questioning its authenticity, despite the evidence, citing St. Gregory saying, "God does not need our lies," implying the Church did need this alleged lie.
So they label the Trinity itself.
An unholy forgery.
Wow. Okay, so beyond texts, the sources claim historical events and documents were also faked for church power.
Absolutely. The conversion of Constantine, the first Christian Roman emperor, based on pious forged miracles, according to the source.
And the donation of Constantine.
Called a fraudulent document. This is a text supposedly written by Constantine granting the Pope vast secular power. The source claims it was a key tool used to build papal supremacy over rulers.
What about the false decretals?
Also labeled fraudulent, spurious decretals. These were letters and decrees falsely attributed to early popes. Again, the source says they were used to construct the great fabric of papal supremacy over the different national churches, admitting the forgery was obvious centuries ago, but it still did its job.
So the argument is a pattern of fabrication for power. What about the consequences of religion's influence, according to these sources? Violence, repression.
Big themes. They argue rulers historically used priests and fear, specifically mentioning the Hebrew fear of Yahweh, to control people.
And when the Roman Empire became Christian,
The source describes it becoming a theocratic religious state. They claim the church essentially forced the state to treat crimes against faith, like heresy, as high treason.
punishable by death.
Yes, under laws like the Code of Theodosius and the Justinian Code. The source asserts Catholic and citizen of the state became identical terms, meaning no room for dissent or non-belief.
And heresy itself.
It is portrayed as tearing society apart, breaking the bonds of charity, leading directly to violence, the sword, and pyres, all in the name of repression. This whole history is summed up as the confessed accursed record of Christianity.
The sources also seem very critical of religion's impact on science and knowledge.
Extremely critical. They contrast it with pagan Greece, where they claim science flourished under figures like Sales and Anaximander because it was unshackled by religious dogma, bans, or an inquisition.
But under Christendom,
They claim Greek learning was essentially lost for 1,000 years in the West. Why? Because a civilization thoroughly saturated with Christianity was supposedly incapable of scientific thought.
the Inquisition gets mentioned specifically.
Yes, established against heretics, but also against other innovators, which included scientists. They claimed the church repressed medical science, ignored plagues, hindered anatomical study, mentioning Vesalius, the famous anatomist, fearing church censure.
And do these critiques connect to the present day?
They do. The sources argue religious fanaticism is still a problem, imposing beliefs like Genesis science, firing teachers, trying to control schools, jeopardizing peace. They claim a corrupt and insulting ecclesiastical government is still rampant, and that the 20th century was still living under the hangover spell of medieval theology.
That's a comprehensive and damning assessment of religious history and influence.
It really pulls no punches.
Okay, let's change tack slightly. The sources also draw a contrast between their own perspective, the Pledge and Meier teachings, and what they label New Age philosophies.
Yes, they do. And they use specific channeled material attributed to someone named Janny King as a prime example of what they see as problematic New Age thinking.
And they claim this material is contradictory to the figure they call the real Ta.
Exactly. Completely at odds, they say.
So what are the key ideas they attribute to these common New Age teachings, using Janny King as the example?
Things like, don't judge in any way, don't think. Just be passive, essentially.
Also the idea about fixing the world.
Right. You don't need to do anything to fix the world, just think of yourself. Sort of an inward focus that neglects external problems.
And the concept of evil?
The idea that if you acknowledge an evil, you make it real. And that judging wrong in the world is just a reflection of yourself, kind of blaming the victim or absolving responsibility.
What about suffering, pain, discordant situations?
The source claims these teachings suggest we create these things, diseasement, agony for ourselves.
Why would we do that?
To understand unity, apparently. To discover the God you are. And therefore, you should just bless these negative experiences and accept them without trying to change anything.
So any action against evil is seen negatively.
It's assumed to come from fear, according to how the source portrays these teachings.
Okay, so that's the New Age side as presented. What about the Pledgerin and Billy Meier tenets in contrast?
A very different emphasis. A core principle is taking personal responsibility for thoughts, words, and deeds. Active responsibility.
And striving, acting against evil.
Yes, the necessity of striving. And critically, the responsibility of speaking out and acting against evil. But importantly, they claim this action shouldn't come from fear.
Where should it come from then?
From understanding universal laws, creational laws. And they assert that as you gain knowledge, all fear disappears.
So knowledge dispels fear, enabling right action.
That seems to be the idea. They stress following creational laws and directives, which they say apply universally, can't be changed to suit human whims, and are visible in nature.
And following these laws guarantees
A creation-aligned forming of life, living in harmony with the universe, essentially.
What else is emphasized in the Meier perspective?
Actively seeking knowledge, wisdom, truth, peace, freedom, and love. And exercising reverence and respect, not just for humans, but for all of creations.
Reverence and veneration
Are called fundamental prerequisites for understanding anything. Respecting both positive and negative aspects of reality as long as they haven't fallen into degeneration.
There's also a strong point about how knowledge is gained, isn't there?
Crucial point. The source argues that genuine knowledge of truth is valuable only if it's obtained through one's own thinking.
Own thinking, not just accepting information.
Right. It requires actively solving the secrets which the wealth of thinking contain. It's an internal, personal, intellectual effort. You have to figure it out yourself.
So external proofs aren't the focus.
No. They double down on this, saying genuine proofs come only from internal sources. Inner perceptions, values, cognitions, knowledge experiences, and Erlebnis, German for experiences, as well as the inner knowledge and the wisdom. It's all about inner validation.
Which brings us back to that specific criticism of Janny King's channeling.
Yes, calling it audacious, completely at odds with the real Ta. And they link Janny King to this figure, Saint-Germain.
Who the Pledgerin allegedly described how?
In extremely negative terms.
Ugh.
A greatest deceiver, charlatan, liar, and spy. Working for a sect obsessed with world domination. They even reference a specific book, Psychic Dictatorship in America.
Wow, that's quite an accusation tying channeling to conspiracy.
It definitely adds another layer to their critique of certain spiritual movements.
So this whole contrasting philosophy emphasizing personal responsibility, thinking for yourself, acting against degeneration based on creational laws, how does it connect back to the bigger picture, the prophecies?
It seems to be presented as the solution. The way out of that bleak future described in the prophecies.
The path away from self-destruction.
Exactly. It connects to that call for humanity to change course. The sources explicitly state that those dire prophecies aren't necessarily fixed.
They can be changed.
Yes. They say arresting countermeasures can still change everything for the better, but only if people, and especially those in positions of responsibility, actually wake up and act according to these principles.
So there's an element of hope, but it requires significant change based on this specific worldview.
Precisely. It's a conditional hope, dependent on adopting this framework of responsibility and adherence to creational law.
Okay, so wrapping this all up, what does this mean for you listening?
Well, we've taken a pretty deep dive here into material that, frankly, throws down the gauntlet to conventional history and religion.
Yeah, presenting an alternative history, lineage of prophets,
Yeah.
really grim warnings about our future driven by overpopulation and moral decline.
In contrasting all that with this specific path guided by creational laws, personal responsibility, and crucially, independent thought.
The sources we looked at are basically claiming a massive centuries-long cover-up, that much of what people believe is a deliberate distortion, a falsification of an original truth focused on wisdom, unity, and natural laws.
All supposedly orchestrated by power structures wanting control.
So this deep dive really leaves you with a big question, doesn't it? If, as these sources claim, genuine proof comes only from internal perceptions, values, cognitions, knowledge, experiences, and the inner knowledge and the wisdom.
Right. If external proof is secondary or even irrelevant.
Then how do you, the listener, actually discern truth when faced with such radically opposing narratives? About history, about spirituality, about where we're all heading.
Especially when one narrative claims the other is built entirely on lies. How do you use that inner knowing to navigate something like this?
Definitely something to mull over, or perhaps explore further on your own.